I can still feel the subterranean chill of the bunker beneath the Imperial Palace. We had grown accustomed to the rhythmic tremble of B-29 raids, a terrible lullaby of steel and fire that spoke of conventional, predictable death. But on the morning of August 6, 1945, the air was different. It was a silence that tasted like ozone and ash, a deep, pervasive quiet that seemed to swallow all sound. I felt a cold dread, an unnerving intuition that the very rules of war, the geometry of destruction we had mastered, had been torn apart. We were listening to the sound of a god turning away. My first instinct, our collective instinct within the inner circle, was a desperate, almost pathetic, disbelief. Hiroshima. The reports arriving were fragmented, filtered through the shattered communications lines, soaked in the ink of initial fear and official denial. A single bomb, a city vaporized. Impossible. It was deemed a monstrous, calculated exaggeration from a desperate enemy seeking to break our resolve before the inevitable ground invasion of the home islands. I remember us debating the physics, the metallurgy, trying to fit this incomprehensible horror into our existing maps of destruction, attempting to quantify the impossible so we could defeat it. But the man sent back from the ruins, the scientist who reached us days later, his uniform irradiated and his eyes hollowed out, his gaze held the true, terrifying map. He spoke of shadows burned into stone, of heat that melted steel without flame, and of a world that was simply gone. Yet still, the samurai spirit, the ingrained dogma of 1,000 years, held us captive. We clung to the certainty of *KETSU-GO*, the glorious final defense, where every man, woman, and child would become a sharpened sword against the invader. We would make them bleed for every inch of our sacred soil. We had 3 days. 3 days where the very soul of the nation hung, suspended in that terrible, fragile quiet, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I saw the Emperor's reflection in the faces of the war council, a silent reckoning playing out. A supreme internal conflict between divine mandate and brutal reality. The hardliners spoke of maintaining the national essence, of dying honorably to prevent the shame of surrender. I felt the pull of that ancient, powerful code, the demand for self-immolation rather than dishonor. But then, on the 9th of August, the clock stopped forever. Nagasaki. Nagasaki was not a matter of physics, it was a curse. It was the absolute crushing confirmation that the enemy had not merely a single weapon, but a stockpile, a capacity for limitless, instantaneous annihilation. I felt the cold realization wash over us. They had to. How many more sat on airfields across the Pacific? The chilling mathematics of survival replaced the heroic calculus of death. And just hours after the second blast, the final, poisoned dagger twisted in our back, the Soviet declaration of war. I remember the map room suddenly feeling like an oven. Despite the subterranean damp, we had banked everything on Moscow's neutrality, their potential role as a mediator, the last slim thread of hope we had allowed ourselves to weave. Now, their armored columns were tearing into Manchukuo, sweeping aside the Kwantung Army, our last strategic reserve, with terrifying speed. The war was no longer a single-front defense against an enemy 10,000 miles away. It was an invasion closing in from every cardinal direction, a suffocating vice grip from the Americans in the south and the Russians in the north. That, I know now, was the hour. That was the moment when the impossible became the truth, when the Imperial Command, as a collective entity of will and belief, fractured beyond repair. I stood in that suffocating council room, where the air was thick with the scent of old silk, fear, and impending doom. The division was a chasm. The military faction, led by the stoic and haunted War Minister Anami, still screaming for the glorious final sacrifice. I understood his agony, the agony of the warrior ethos demanding that we meet destruction with our chins up. But I also saw the silent, hollowed-out faces of the diplomats and officials who had seen the reports from the civilian centers. The children, the women, the millions who would be needlessly pulverized in a final stand. The decision was not theirs to make. The weight of centuries, of the very nation's existence, rested upon a single, quiet man. I heard his voice, not the booming command of a warlord, but the soft, almost painful murmur of a father choosing the life of his children over his own divine pride. "I cannot bear to see my people suffer further," he said, his voice barely rising above a whisper, yet resonating with an authority that swept away the arguments of every general, every admiral, every hardliner in the room. He spoke of enduring the unendurable, of swallowing the shame. That single sentence, spoken by a god figure, broke the spell of the warrior class. I felt the surrender, not just of a war, but of a 1,000-year-old ideology, crumbled to dust. The next day, I listened, along with a stunned and silent populace, as the voice, normally reserved for ancient rituals, was broadcast across the shattered empire. It was static-filled, high-pitched, speaking in a court language almost unintelligible to the common people, speaking of a decision based on new and cruel weapons, of laying down the sword to save the race. For the first time in 4 years, I felt the nation, not the army, breathe a collective, ragged breath. I looked out over the wreckage of Tokyo, a landscape of twisted metal and ghosts. The smell of burnt wood and ozone clung to everything. We survived, yes, but the world we knew was gone, vaporized not just by the bombs, but by the cold, brutal realization that honor, once the supreme currency, could be outweighed by the simple, terrible arithmetic of human lives. I carry that cold realization with me still. It is the cost of knowing when the impossible has arrived, and the silence remains.